Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's class. I hope you're all doing well and staying safe. So today we're going to be talking about the North-South gap and international development. To do so, I've chosen to kind of structure this lecture through by looking at the Millennium Development Goals. The reason I've done so is for a few different reasons. First, it allows us to kind of get um, through looking at the kind of the Millennium Development Goal, the metrics, gives us an idea of kind of the scope of the problem. So what are some of the areas where we just see um, a huge need for development still needed, that there's still major problems. Second is to kind of see how international organizations and different actors can play a role in trying to help solve problems of underdevelopment and kind of help solve the north-south gap. And third is to show that even with tremendous progress in terms of um, you know, uh, international organizations and private citizens and corporations and others working and governments working together to solve the problem, that even with all the progress we've made, there's still so much more that can be done. Um, so what are the Millennium Development Goals? So the MDG are 8 goals that all 191 UN member states have agreed to try to achieve by the year 2015. So since we're past 2015, we can kind of look back retrospectively to see how did we do. The United Nations Millennium Declaration, signed in September 2000, commits world leaders to combat poverty, hunger, disease, illiteracy, environmental degradation, and discrimination against women. So these were the kind of the focus areas. Uh, and the MDGs are derived from the declaration and all have specific targets and indicators. So in the Millennium Declaration, set out kind of certain areas that needed to be addressed. And the MDGs help to kind of formalize very specific targets, but not only targets, but indicators for what would be considered success and failure. So really operationalize these different terms into different, signals that we could see of progress. What does it mean to combat poverty? What does it mean to combat hunger or disease or illiteracy? So by giving very specific targets, we can kind of see, we can better measure progress and see how are we doing. So here are the development goals listed out. So we have to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and empower women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, and develop a global partnership for development. So the global partnership, we're talking about not just the UN, but getting governments and particularly private actors, so getting corporations involved in solving the problems. There's areas where the UN, the underdeveloped states, and corporations actually have, kind of shared interests. It's in many corporations' interest for increased development. For example, a multinational corporation that's operating in an underdeveloped country or a less developed country, and if they're using local workers, well, many of these problems will also affect their workers. So, for example, diseases will have more sick days. Um, so, in terms of illiteracy, you'll have a less skilled workforce. So, many of these are also in corporations' best interest as well. So to try to develop a partnership where oftentimes, the UN may have expertise but may not have funding. Corporations may have funding but not necessarily expertise. And so you can try to make, partnerships to deal with individual problems. So the results. So MDG targets were supposed to be met by 2015. Historic progress was made on many of these goals. For example, more than 1 billion people were lifted out of extreme poverty. And anytime you can lift 1 billion people out of extreme poverty, that's a pretty significant result. That's pretty good. So that's a very big positive that historic progress was made, and this is a really nice statistic. But there's a lot that needs still to be done, right? So not all the targets were met. Some of them, still made significant progress, even the targets weren't met. Some even surpassed the targets. But even when we surpass the targets, it doesn't mean the situation is good. It's better than it was, but it doesn't. That's what's interesting in looking at some of the targets when we see them. Even the ones where it's successful, it doesn't mean you'll still look at what the state of the situation is in many of those countries, and it will still be shocked at how bad it is, but it is still an improvement. So this shows that we can do a lot if there's a concerted effort, but we don't want to rest on what we've done. There's still so much more to be done. And I took these figures from the MDG report 2015. So here's regional grouping. So sometimes the different figures will be broken down by groups. So when they list groups, this is what we talked about. So developed. So we've got for here and Australia, New Zealand, Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Western Asia over here, Southern Asia over here, Eastern Asia over here, Caucasus and Central Asia over here, Oceania down there, Latin America down here, Southeastern Asia, I mean, the color doesn't seem to fit, but it's pretty much all that's left. And so those are the different. So when we're looking, that's what we're talking about when you look in the groupings and see. All right, so MDG 1, eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. So here's a figure looking at the number of people living in, so here's kind of the result. The number of people living in extreme poverty has declined by more than half since 1990. So here's a figure, number of people living on less than $1.25 a day worldwide, 1991 to 2015. So this is how we'd be defining extreme poverty, living on less than $1.25 a day. Now, even though if you just surpass that, right, that's extreme poverty. If you're still living on $1.50 a day, that's still not a lot of money. That's still poverty. So still in looking, and when we look at the final result, we still have, so this is millions, we still have 836 million people in 2015 who are living in extreme poverty. But considering that we're starting at, 1.926 billion people, to be getting it down to 836 million is still, big progress. All right. So here's to break down a little bit of poverty. So this is a ratio of women to men of working age 20 to 59 in the lowest wealth quintile of all households selected for developing countries. So in 41 countries, women are more likely than men to live in poor households. In 17 countries, women are equally likely to live in poor households, and in 17 countries, women are less likely than men to live in poor households. So in a majority of the cases, women are more likely than men to live in extreme poverty. So in future goals, that's something definitely to want to be looking at, is why is it that women are more likely to live in extreme poverty, and what could be done to address that? Because that's clearly somewhere where there's an extra problem, and one that we still haven't been able to solve as much. Employment opportunities are being outpaced by the growing labor force. So we've got employment to population ratio, 1991-2015. So in 1991, we had 64, uh, and it's now down to 61, which means that there's fewer jobs per person, right? If there are 100 jobs to 100 people, then we would have, you know, rate of 100. But here there were 64, now it's down to 61. It's not a huge change, but if it becomes, a long-term trend, that would be concerning. We even see a small drop in uh, in developed countries or in developed regions. So in terms of trying to address poverty, this could be no problem if jobs to population are declining. If people don't have jobs, it's hard to stay out of extreme poverty. The proportion of workers living in extreme poverty has fallen sharply. So proportion of employed people living on less than $1.25 a day, 1991 to 2015. So this is showing, remember the last slide we saw that kind of employment opportunities per capita are declining. And this shows partially how important it is for employment opportunities. And this is tremendous progress here, seeing that it used to be in developing regions, 52% of people, even who had a job, still lived in extreme poverty. So not less than $1.25 a day. This is now down to 11, which is still shocking that there's 11 that you can have a job and still be living on less than $1.25 a day. But compared to it used to be 52 in 1991, and then in the next 25 years we were able to get it down to 11, is huge progress. The working middle class makes up almost half the workforce in developing regions. So employment by economic class in developing region, 1991 to 2015. So here's 1991 and here's 2015 projection. So it used to be that 49% lived in extremely poor. That's down to 11%. Moderately poor, so between $1.25 and $2, 19%. So that's held relatively stable, a slight decline. Near poor, between $2 and $4, so 14 up to 25. So there's been progress there. That's gone up, but the biggest jump has been in the developing middle class, so between 4 and 13 an hour. And here, so we see now 35%, the biggest category is this developing middle class. And then developed middle class is also growing. So this chart is going in the completely right direction, but there's still a lot of progress to be made. This group is still, very large, near poor. We still, if we add this up, end up at more than half the people are in some form of near poor, moderately poor, or extremely poor. We're still dealing with more than half. But the trend is good when we're looking at the workforce, right? We're seeing the people getting better compensation from working. Progress on ending hunger has been significant despite a challenging global environment. So number and proportion of undernourished people in the developing region. So the left axis is the number of undernourished people, so in millions. The right axis is proportions of undernourished people, also proportions of percentage of the population. And so we can see a decline, particularly in terms of the proportion. Here we're seeing from 23% down to 12%, or 12.9, so 13%. So we're definitely seeing a decline. There's more work to be done. The raw numbers are still very high, so still around 780 million people are undernourished in the developing world. But it's still, we're still seeing progress, which is kind of fitting with the story I've been telling you, that through concerted action, we've been able to, this is a huge improvement. If we're going from 23 to 13 in that time span, that's a huge improvement. But if you look at where we still are, 780 million people, or 12.9%, of people in the developing region are undernourished, that's still way too much. Conflict, so in terms of if you want to be helping poverty, conflicts and displacing people from their home is a major source of undernourishment, poverty, loss of employment, everything like that. And so we can see that conflicts are a growing cause for people to be leaving their homes. So we certainly see a spike up around 2010, 2011, but it's always been high, but with that trend upwards. So we've got refugees and asylum seekers and internally displaced persons. And then this is the total number. So this is in millions. So we've got about in 2014, we had around 60 million either refugees, asylum seekers, or internally displaced persons, which is a massive number. All right, so MDG 2, achieve universal primary education. So in developing countries, primary school enrollment rates in 2000 was 83%. In 2015, it's up to 91%. Out of school children of primary school age, in 2000, we had 100 million. In 2015, we had 57 million. And poor children are 4 times as likely to be out of school in developing countries. So dealing with extreme poverty will help get children into school. So this is progress, again, a near halving of total number, a significant increase when we're talking 83 to 91, that's a large increase, but we're still dealing with 57 million people out of school, and children who most need help are the ones who are most likely to be out of school. MDG 3, promote gender equality and empower women. So about 2/3 of countries in the developing world have achieved gender parity in primary education. So that's progress, but that still means 1/3 of countries in the developing world don't have gender parity in primary education. So usually boys would be more likely to be going to school than girls. So distribution of countries in developing regions by status of gender parity target achievement in primary, secondary, and tertiary education. So like elementary school, high school, and post-secondary school. So this color is target not reached disparities against females. Target reached is blue, and then target not reached disparities against men is over here. So distribution of countries. So in primary education, we see still, there's been progress from 52 up to 64 where targets met. So there's still there's progress, but we still see that there's an overwhelming, still 29% of countries have disparities against women in terms of primary education, so they're less likely to go to school. There's a few cases where, and actually growing, where men are less likely to be going to school. Secondary education, which is interesting, we see as children get older, the situation changes and almost reverses. In secondary education, the 3 groups are almost equal in size. We do see progress in terms of 26 to 36 in terms of about equal, so that's good progress. And the growth has been in terms of affecting both areas of disparity. So where women are disadvantaged and where men are disadvantaged. And then finally, in tertiary education, we actually see very few countries where there's equal. And actually, in the majority of cases, nearly 2/3 of them, men are less likely to go to higher education. And there could be a number of different factors for that. Labor participation. So looking at working age men and women. So for men, we have 72% are employed, 4% unemployed, and then 23% are economically inactive. So not employed, not looking for work, or at least actively looking for work. When we're dealing with women, it's the situation is much different. So we've got similar numbers of unemployed, but a much greater number of economically inactive, and so a much smaller number of employed. So in terms of, we saw earlier that women are more likely to be in poverty. This could be part of the explanation, right? Men are more likely to be employed. And so that will be giving resources to the men, and particularly if you've got single men or single women, if single women are also finding it more difficult to find employment, then they would have no source of income. Women elected to parliament has nearly doubled or any legislature, has nearly doubled in the last 20 years. So that's a large improvement. Doubling is certainly a good progress, but only about 1 in 5 members of parliament are women. It's only about 20%, which is still a disappointing number. We're still long ways off from having equal representation. So women's political representation has increased, but parity remains a distant goal. So here's proportion of seats held by women in single or lower houses of national parliament. So developed regions, we've gone from 16% up to 26% for women a share, in developing 12 to 21, and overall from 14 up to 22. So in all cases, we see progress, but even in developed regions, that progress is still, 1/4, which still isn't nearly enough is to call this parity, to call it equality. Right, so MDG 4, reduce child mortality. So substantial progress has been made in reducing child mortality, but more children can be saved from deaths due to preventable causes. So here we've got under 5 mortality rate, 1990 and 2015. So this is death per 1,000 live births. So in developed regions, we see a decrease of child mortality, so down from 15 to 6. So not only did it meet the target, or came close to meeting the target, but we see a decrease of 61%, which is a huge decrease. In developed, we see it went down from 100. So 100. It used to be 100 deaths per 1,000 live births in 1990. Now it's down to 47. So it didn't quite make the target. Still a substantial decrease. But if we look at this and compare it to developed world, there's still a massive difference. And this is 47 deaths out of every 1,000. So that's about 1 in 20 births or deaths per live birth. So that's a shockingly high number in the world, down from 90 to 43. Since the developing world has more population, that's why it's more similar here. So again, it's another situation where progress, can't complain about decrease of 53% in that time frame. That's significant progress. And so we didn't quite make the target, but it's still significant progress. But if you look, so that's, our glass half full side. But conversely, if we just look at this raw number here or this raw number here, there's still a lot to be, to be wishing for, or a lot still to be desired. Measles immunization has saved millions of children's lives, but progress toward eliminating measles has stalled. So here we have estimated child deaths due to measles in thousands, and proportion of children in appropriate age groups who received at least one dose of measles-containing vaccine, so in percentage. So we see kind of progress that percentage of children getting vaccinated is at least one dose is increasing. We see the total number of cases of measles is going down, but it does seem from 20 different, like around 2005 to 2013, that there's been relatively little progress. Again, here too, in terms of percentage, most of the decreases seem to happen around the 2000 to 2005, a little bit here too, and then it just seems to have flattened a little bit. And we're still dealing with uh, 100 million, or sorry, 100,000 deaths due to measles. And we're still dealing with 15% who aren't getting even one dose. So this is something where this is tremendous improvement. I mean, it used to, around 1992-ish, it looks like there were about 700,000 deaths to measles, which is a massive number. Even over here, we're talking more than 500,000 deaths to measles, which is massive numbers. And we see vaccination, increasing to 70 to 85 is great. We see deaths going from 500,000 or 700,000 down to just over 100,000, is great, but that's still a lot of deaths, and that's still a lot of unvaccinated children. Improved maternal health. So here's maternal mortality rate in 1990, 2000, and 2013. And so it's defined as maternal deaths per 100,000 live births, women aged 15 to 49. So in developed regions, we see steady decrease, so 37% decrease in maternal deaths, 26 to 17 to 16, which seems to be right around the target. In developing, we see, again, tremendous progress, decrease of 46%, did not meet the target, didn't even really come close to the target. So we see tremendous progress, not enough progress, both in terms of not reaching the target, but also we still have 230 maternal deaths per 100,000 live births, which is still too high, particularly given that in the developed world. So if you've got the appropriate, maternal care, we can get it down to, about, with current technology and current everything, know-how, we can get it down to about 16. 230 is way too high in comparison. So proportion of deliveries attended by skilled health personnel in 1990, 2000, 2014. So in developing regions, so we see progress, but still only about 70% of births are attended by a skilled health personnel. So 30% there's no health personnel present for the birth who are skilled in delivery and in maternal care. And so that helps explain both some level of child mortality, but also probably more so maternal mortality. And the numbers for the world are very similar. Okay, so inequalities in access to maternal health persist across most regions. And so we see in almost all regions other than East Asia, where there's not really a problem, because we've got 100% proportion of deliveries attended by skilled personnel. We see that a big part of the problem for having skilled health personnel attending there for a delivery is in rural regions. In most regions, the proportion is actually quite good for urban areas. There's a few, so 75, 77, 75 are still quite low in Southern Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and West Africa, but a lot of them, so in Western Asia, Latin America, Southeastern Asia, it's quite good in urban areas. Even over here, it's not good enough, but it's still quite high. Where we see the huge problem is down in many of the rural areas. So in Central Africa, we've got 32% of childbirths have a skilled health professional. 33% in West Africa, 38% in Sub-Saharan Africa, 40% in Eastern Africa, 42% in Southern Asia. Uh, and so when we look at the developing region kind of all aggregated together, we have a discrepancy of 87% in urban areas and 56% in rural areas. It may be just not enough skilled health personnel in countries, and so they're all amassed in cities, and so there's just not enough personnel or resources to set up enough clinics in rural areas or enough hospitals in rural areas. And so that's definitely, a lot of work needs to be done in rural area healthcare. So after years of slow growth, only half of pregnant women receive the recommended amount of antenatal care. So here we've got proportion of women 15 to 49 attended 4 or more times by any provider during pregnancy in 1990, 2000, and 2014. So these are percentages. And so in developing regions overall, and here's by different regions. So we see still an improvement, which is always really good. But we also still see that the proportion of women attended 4 or more times by any provider during pregnancy in many of the regions. So Latin American, Caribbean, okay, it's pretty good. There's been tremendous progress, and it's nearly everyone, so up to 97%. Northern Africa up to 89%, which is definitely a huge improvement from 50 up to 89%. Up to 84% in Southeastern Asia, from 45 up to 84. That's tremendous progress. We see some progress in Southern Asia, 23 up to 36, so that's progress. But it's still extremely low. 36% is extremely, it's just over 1/3 of women are attended 4 or more times by a provider during pregnancy. In Sub-Saharan Africa, we see is actually doing better than Southern Asia in terms of raw numbers or raw percentages, but we don't really see much improvement. It's relatively flat across all of this, so kind of stuck. So something needs to happen here to be able to start kickstarting, at least in Southern Asia. While it's low, we're seeing it trend in the right direction. In Sub-Saharan Africa, we're not seeing much of a trend in the right direction. So contraceptive use has risen, but unmet need is still high in some regions. So here's proportion of women aged 15 to 49 worldwide, married or in union, who have an unmet need for family planning or who are using any method of contraception. So contraceptive prevalence has increased, but there's still large need for unmet family planning. And here's a total demand for family planning. So it's sum of contraceptive prevalence and unmet need for family planning. So we see a decreasing unmet need here, but there still is an unmet need for people who would either want contraceptive or some form of family planning and just can't get it. All right, so MDG 6, combat HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. So let's start with HIV. So new HIV infections fell by almost 40%. So in 2000, 3.5 million, to 2013, 2.1 million. So that's tremendous progress. This is still a really big number, but that's immense progress. So estimated number of new HIV infections 2000 and 2013 in thousands. So in developing regions, so we had so almost 3.5 million, and here about in 2013 almost 2 million in developing regions. Uh, in developed regions, um, we actually see a slight increase in HIV, but the total number overall is low compared to the developing regions. So still in terms of, even though a lot of progress has been made in developing regions, this is a huge decrease. Um, First, there's still a lot of cases, new cases coming in developing regions. Um, and still the bulk of the problem is in developing regions. Now, this is a little concerning that in developed regions, it's gone up. So that's definitely something of potential concern. But in terms of the global problem, it's definitely something where it's spreading a lot more frequently in developing regions. So knowledge of HIV and HIV prevention remains low among young people. So here's proportion of women and men aged 15 to 24 in sub-Saharan Africa with comprehensive correct knowledge of HIV transmission and reporting condom use at last higher risk sex. So among around 2000 and 2014%. So here's comprehensive correct knowledge of HIV. So around 2000 in women it was 21. It's up to 30. So that's progress. And in men, it's from 28 to 37. So there's progress, but that's still only around 2014. Only 30% of women and 37% men report or have comprehensive correct knowledge of HIV. So that's still, if we're talking about why is it that it's able to spread still so much. So part of the reason that it's going down could be that there's, in both cases for men and women, there's an improvement, but it's still well under half of people of men and women aged 15 to 24 have a correct understanding or a comprehensive understanding of how HIV/AIDS is spread. So it's hard to protect yourself from HIV/AIDS if you don't know how you get it. In terms of condom use, we see large increases. So women reporting from 23 up to 40, men from 42 up to 59. So we're seeing tremendous progress here. Again, much lower than we would be wanting, but progress. So this will help in the spread of AIDS, help combat the spread of AIDS. But we would like to see these numbers obviously much higher. So it's again another one in our story of progress, but still a lot of work needs to be done. Number of children orphaned by AIDS is beginning to fall, but millions still need protection and care. So this is estimated number of AIDS-related orphans worldwide, 2000 to 2013 in millions. So at its peak, we had, slightly over 18.5 million AIDS-related orphans worldwide. So as the number of new cases decreases, this number will start to decrease, and we are seeing that. But this is still a massive number of children who are orphans because of AIDS. So again, we're trending downwards, and that's fantastic. It also shows kind of, that there's a lot of costs to disease like AIDS, not just to the person who has it, but in terms of, orphaning children. So a massive global expansion of access to antiretroviral therapy has averted millions of deaths. So here we see number of people receiving antiretroviral therapy in 2003 to 2015, number of deaths from AIDS-related causes, and number of people newly infected with HIV. So people receiving antiretroviral, we see increasing massively, not quite up to where we our target, but well on the way, because the target was 2015. This is last data 2013. So by 2015, it may, based on the trend line, may have made it. People newly infected with AIDS, we see a slight decrease, which is great. And people dying from HIV-related causes. trending downwards. So as this goes up, this should help in terms of people who have contacted AIDS in them being able to live longer and healthier. So now we're going to turn to malaria. So increased global attention to the devastating effects of malaria has produced significant results. So here we see the estimated change in malaria incidence rates, so cases per 1,000 population at risk, and malaria mortality rate, deaths per 100,000 people at risk in 2000 to 2015. So the blue line, we've got estimated malaria incidence rate. So we see it decreasing here from 147 per 1,000 to about 92. Here's estimated malaria mortality rate, so from 48 down to about 20. So tremendous progress on malaria, but there's still a lot of people being killed. So still 20 per 100,000 people at risk. And here's still 92 per 1,000 contracting the disease. But we're seeing tremendous progress also. Access to malaria prevention intervention has expanded dramatically since 2000. So here's proportion of children under age 5 sleeping under insecticide-treated mosquito nets for selected countries in sub-Saharan Africa around 2001 and 2013. So these are different countries, and we're seeing a lot of progress. So in all of them, we see that around 2001 it was almost nobody. So in Gambia it was 15, in Comoros it was around 9, but in most of the other ones it was near 0. And now we see, with the high of Rwanda being up to 74%. Now there's still some in Nigeria. It's still extremely low. But in all the countries on the list, we see an improvement. And in some of them, extremely dramatic improvement. So we're on from 4 up to 74% in that amount of time. And that's going to help save a lot of lives. So this is, at least particularly on all of them, in terms of that there's an improvement. And in some of them in terms of just how drastic that improvement has been, there's a lot of really good progress there. All right, so MDG 7, ensure environmental sustainability. So global greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise and are now more than 50% higher than the 1990 levels. So in emissions of carbon dioxide, so in 1990, 2000, 2012, near billions of metric tons. So in developed regions, we see a slight decrease over time in emissions, slight. But in developing regions, we see massive increases. And so overall, in terms of the world, we see massive increases. And in each time period increasing, with the most significant jump being between 2000 and 2012. Now, this, to a large extent, makes sense, right? Because as we're getting more and more development in the developing regions, then when you're getting development, also with that's going to come emissions, particularly because a lot of the development, the companies developing don't necessarily have the technologies for cleaner tech, don't have the resources, or technology for greener tech. So a lot of development is more dirty, but also just as each person gets greater resources in the developing region, for example, with more resources, you may have more people owning cars. And if you have more people owning cars, you're going to see emissions going up. So this is one of the tricky points with the MDGs, where you see some level of tension, right? Because we very, very much want to see economic development and need to see economic development of the developing world. Because there's still so many people living in poverty or without proper health care and stuff like that. So we definitely need to see tremendous development in developing regions. At the same time, we have to try to make sure that it's done in a sustainable manner so that, if we look at it, more emissions come from the developing world than the developed world. Now, there's also a lot more people living in the developing world than the developed world. But if changes in emissions only happen in the developed world, we're still going to face a major problem. So we have to figure out, and this is so one of the hardest ones to resolve, is how do we get economic development in the developing world without sacrificing the environment? How can we do development sustainably? How can we get so that developing region, as they develop, can still be competitive economically, but not polluting kind of in the same way that we did when we were developing. Because the world, with the amount of people who live in the developing region, the world just really could not sustain, say, developed world per capita level of pollution if everyone did it. So the developed world needs to massively cut their emissions. But the same way, we have to be able to figure out a way that we can help the developing world economically develop, but do so in a sustainable manner. So one very positive story is in terms of the ozone layer, which was a huge worry in the 80s and early 90s, hole in the ozone layer. So we see the ozone layer is expected to recover by mid-century thanks to concerted global efforts to eliminate ozone-depleting substances. So here we see consumption of ozone-depleting substances from 1986 to 2013. So in developed regions and overall in the world, so it's down to near zero almost everywhere. So if we look in the world and developed regions, it's near zero. So this is a huge success where agreements were able to be found, and based on getting rid of the ozone depleting substances, it's been able to repair itself. And that's a really huge success story. The downside to the success story is that it was a relatively easy story, because most ozone depleting substances, there were replacements that were available. And so it wasn't necessarily prohibitive or too economically costly to change for example, from CFCs to alternatives. And because there were alternatives, it wasn't therefore a costly agreement to make. It was relatively easy to get compliance. Everybody saw the problem, everybody agreed on a solution, and it wasn't overly costly to anybody to implement the solution. So compliance wasn't too much of a problem. The problem is in other areas with the environment, the solution isn't necessarily as readily available, and there's many countries that have a stake in some of the kind of dirtier technology, and there's just cost of adjustment because there's research needed, but also just changing all the practices. So there's costly adjustment. So getting compliance, even if we recognize a problem, say with carbon emissions, getting a solution that people comply with is much more difficult. Overexploitation of marine fisheries is rising, threatening ecosystems and livelihoods. So here we see proportion of fish stocks within their safe biological limits. So here, in 1974 to 2011 percentage, and fish landings, 1970 to 2013, millions of metric tons. So left axis, fish landings, so that's catch that's brought ashore. We're seeing, large increases. In right axis, fish stocks within safe biological limits are going down. So we see percentage down to about 75% fish within safe biological limits. And if this goes down, right, then eventually if you overfish, the fish aren't able to reproduce efficiently. The fish stocks then won't replenish, and eventually we would just fish. We would remove more fish from the water than can reproduce, and eventually no more fish. So this is a problem that if you overfish and you get rid of too much of the stock, if you fish to the right amount, then the fish can reproduce, and there's a new fish stock each year, and so it's a sustainable source. But if you eventually you begin removing too many fish, and they just can't reproduce enough. And there's many communities around the world in developed and developing regions that rely heavily on fish for sources of food. Water scarcity affects more than 40% of the global population and is projected to rise. So water scarcity is definitely a problem that's going to continue to increase, and it's one that we're going to have to watch because water is vital to life, to industry, to agriculture, to so many different things. Access to water is essential. And so losing water would have so many impacts in terms of nourishment, so just people need water to survive, but also in terms of getting agriculture for feeding people. So if we're talking about undernourishment, if in certain regions the agricultural industry collapses, that would be a big problem. So here's proportion of renewable water resources withdrawn around 2011, so percentage. So at 25%, so in this category, we have abundant water resources. 25 to 60%, so in this category, we've got water is stressed at 60 to 75%. So in this category, we have water scarcity, and then in the 75 to 100, we have severe water scarcity. So in most regions, this isn't much of a problem yet. So the world, developing and developed regions, overall, it's not a problem. And then we look at Oceania, really not a problem. Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, all within abundant water resources. Southeastern Asia, even Eastern Asia, still within abundant, starting to push out. South Asia and Caucasus and Central Asia and Western Asia are pushing at the water stressed. Western Asia getting pretty close to water scarcity. Northern Africa is the most problematic one at present. Some of these are trending certainly towards it, but Northern Africa has already reached into severe water scarcity. Already having proportion of renewable water resources withdrawn have already withdrawn about 80% of available water. And so for access for drinking water, but agriculture and everything like that, animals also need water. So in terms of access to livestock and stuff like that, and just for the wider ecosystem, this is potentially really concerning for a lot of different reasons, and some that we'll talk about when we talk about the environment. Okay, so the global MDG target for drinking water has been met 5 years ahead of schedule. So in terms of people having access to safe drinking water, so a proportion of people using an improved drinking water source, 1990 to 2015. For the world, I guess the goal was to hit 90, and that was met in advance. So to get it up to 76 to 90. In developed region, it's around almost everybody, 98 to up to 99%. Developing, a huge improvement from 70 to 89%. We still see some regions where there's problems that did not meet the targets. So Oceania from 50 to 56, so an improvement, but nowhere near what we wanted. So that's still uh, nearly half, just under half of people who are not using safe drinking water. In sub-Saharan Africa, 48 up to 68, so still a massive improvement, but not meeting the target, and that's still 32% of people who don't have access to safe drinking water. Since 1990, 2.1 billion people have gained access to improved sanitation, but the world has missed the MDG target. So developed regions, 94 to 96 proportion of population uses improved sanitation facility. But in developed regions, it's a massive improvement, 43 up to 62. So that's, again, nearly a 20% increase. But it falls short of our target, and that's still a lot of people who don't have access to proper sanitation. Fewer urban residents are living in slums in almost all regions. The proportion of urban population living in slums so decreased from 40% about to 30%, so a 10% decrease. So that's an improvement, but that's still 30% of people, or urban residents are living in slums in developing world. And here's another one showing kind of the decline in terms of percentage. In terms of percentage, we see that decline to 29.7 from all the way here up to in 1990, 46.2, and in 2000, around 39.4. So we see a steady decrease in percentage, but because population is increasing, we're actually seeing in terms of total number of people, an aggregate increase. So it's really positive that the percentage of people is going down, but we're not keeping pace with population growth. So that's one of the problems with high population growth is even when you're making so much progress here in terms of decreasing percentage, if your population outpaces your ability to deal with it, you're still going to be kind of like winning the battle, but losing the war. Because you're still going to have more and more people living in slums in terms of total number of people. And then MDG8 developed a global partnership for development. So foreign assistance, money or other aid made available to developing countries to help them speed up economic development or meet humanitarian needs. Most foreign assistance is provided by governments and is called official development assistance, or ODA. So if we see ODA, it's talking official development assistance. So this is money coming from governments. So the Development Assistance Committee, or DAC, is a committee whose members consisting of states from Western Europe, North America, and Japan Pacific region provide 90% of official development assistance to countries of the global south. So these are kind of your richer countries who provide most of the help to the global south. Aid can be either bilateral, so state to state, or multilateral that goes through an IGO. So you can, so Canada, for example, can give money to an individual state as aid, or it can give money to, say, a UN program that will give aid to multiple different countries. So DAC countries have a goal of 0.7% of the gross national product in foreign aid, but only Denmark, Luxembourg, Norway, Sweden, and the UK exceed that target. So of all the other countries in Western Europe, North America, Japan, Pacific, so of your kind of your DAC country members, they're supposed to meet 0.7%, but other than those 5 countries, none of them can have met that target. And other than the UK, Denmark, Luxembourg, Norway, and Sweden aren't among your, say, your largest economies. So it's fantastic that they made the 0.7 target. But in terms of sheer dollars, we would, they can't shoulder the burden alone. They just don't have the size of economy to shoulder the total need, just based on countries of around 8 million or 4 million, less than that, can't just through their assistance solve all of the problems. UK is a larger economy, but even itself alone couldn't do it. The US gives the most foreign aid, so approximately 30 billion, but the lowest percentage of GNP. So it's the largest amount of foreign aid because it's the largest economy. But if we look at percentage of GNP, it's actually the lowest. Canada gives 4.7 billion, or approximately 0.32% of GNP. So not even half of our target. What are the types of foreign assistance? Excuse me. So we have grants, which are funds given free to a recipient state, usually for some stated purpose. So it's money is given, it doesn't need to be repaid. And often it's kind of tied to a certain project or at least area. Technical cooperation. So these are grants given in the form of expert assistance on some project. So say a country wants to be building a dam or something. A country might give not only financing, but also expertise. So some people who have the technical know-how to design the project. There's credits. So these are grants that can be used to buy certain products from the donor state. And so this is often referred to as tied aid because it's tied to buying certain things. Unfortunately, many of the tied aid is related to military spending, so buying military hardware, which isn't necessarily very useful in terms of helping development for, a developing nation to have advanced fighter jets isn't going to help people put food on the table. Other times, tied aid is related to buying products from, even if it's not related to military, but from kind of like, so Canada might give tied aid, but the credits have to go towards buying products from a Canadian corporation. This still can work out if to the benefit of the country, if the goods that they're buying from that corporation are useful to their development, and it's beneficial to obviously the donor state because it helps out their companies. But because it's also always tied to a particular, say, company or product, it doesn't necessarily allow them to get the most bang for their buck. Loans. So these are funds given to help economic development, which must be repaid in the future out of the surplus generated by the development process. And it's often tied to the purchase of particular products from the donor. So again, it's often tied, not always, but often tied. This assumes for it to be useful that the loan is able to generate sufficient development that it generates a surplus, right? So that it's able to pay back the loan. If it doesn't lead to enough development to generate some form of surplus, then it's actually could end up being a net loss. Then loan guarantees. So these are promises by a donor state to back up commercial loans to a recipient. Loan guarantee allows the recipient state to borrow money at a lower interest rate from a commercial banks. And so this is rarely used, but essentially it's saying, because from the perspective of banks, many developing nations are viewed as a credit risk or default risk. And so they don't get, most, developed countries get very, very good interest rates because they're viewed as almost sure things for repaying their loans. They get the best interest rates of anyone, where developing states often don't. So by kind of guaranteeing the loan, saying that the developed state will, or the donor state will pay the loan off if there's a default, you can get a much better interest rate. And then military aid is very, very common. So in terms of weaponry or stuff like that, not necessarily the most helpful in development. Official development assistance has plateaued in recent years after increasing significantly in the first decade of the new millennium. So we saw a little bit of a rush in the first decade of the new millennium, so increasing around here, but it's kind of just sat flat. Official development assistance from OECD, DAC countries, constant 2013 US billions. So we see the lightest one is net debt relief grants. We see humanitarian aid, multilateral ODA, and then bilateral development projects. So programs and technical cooperation. So we see increases um, across time, but definitely it seems to, like the first decade of the 2000s, there's a little bit of a rush to, or momentum to increasing, and that momentum seems to have stalled. Official development assistance to least developed countries increased significantly over the MDG period. So total ODA and ODA to least developed countries. So net official development assistance from OECD DAC countries as a proportion of donors' gross national product. So from, I guess, don't actually, it says increased significantly, but this actually seems relatively flat to me. So as percentage of of gross, and here total ODA, it seems quite variable. And to least developed countries, I suppose there's some level of uptick from after a decrease in the early 1990s. There's an uptick, but certainly a lot of improvement needed. Imports from developing countries, especially from least developed countries, increasingly receive preferential treatment from developed countries. So reduce trade barriers and stuff like that from least developed countries. This is important to help industry develop. Already, many industries in least developed countries already face competitive disadvantages. If on top of that they have to deal with tariffs and stuff like that, they just won't be competitive. So there's momentum to try to get have products or imports from LDCs admitted duty-free. And we do see a lot of momentum here increasing for developing countries overall. So this partially goes along with just trade liberalization, but also after a very brief decrease here, since 2000, we do see a concerted increase. The debt burden of developing countries fell dramatically over the first decade of the new millennium, but it stabilizes and expected to rise. So external debt service payments, a proportion of export revenues, all developing countries. So yeah, we do see a huge decrease around here, but that's still a lot of money going towards debt service that could be used for paying off, or for development, for just programs to help people. Mobile cellular and internet penetration rates have grown strongly, but the digital divide between the rich and poor is growing. So here we see population, how it's increased. Mobile cellular subscriptions has increased. So mobile cellular has gone almost along with population to almost everyone has mobile cellular. Internet access, so has increased certainly, but still a lot of people, most people don't have, say, aren't internet users. More than half of the world still doesn't have access to internet, but mobile cellular subscriptions is near universal. Information and communication technology access and use are unequally distributed within and between countries. So in developed regions, number of internet users per 100 inhabitants. So in developed regions, it's near 80% have internet access. In the world overall, it's increased from less than 10% in 2000 to almost 40% of the world. Developing countries from near zero up to about 30%, but the least developed countries is where it's really lagging behind that, from really around zero to still in 2015, less than 10%. And given how important the internet is to modern economy, this is still showing a huge area of divide between developed, uh, developing, and least developed countries. All right, so that's it for our discussion of or look at MDGs to help us take a look at some of the problems facing the developing region. So I'll see you next time.